She walked through the storm, alone, carrying nothing but a battered satchel and secrets that could get her killed. He was just a rancher, a man who fixed fences and kept to himself, until fate brought her to his door. What followed wasn't just a fight for survival. It was a fight for something deeper: love, truth, and a life worth standing for. Stay with us, because once you hear how it ends, you'll never forget how it began. The wire hummed a haunting tune that afternoon, singing low like a fiddle bow dragged across rusted strings. It wasn't the kind of sound you'd notice unless you were used to silence, unless you'd spent years listening to the land more than to people. Luke Rawlins was that kind of man. He squatted beside the fence line on the edge of his ranch in Monument Valley, Arizona, a pair of pliers clenched in a weathered hand, sweat cutting tracks through the dust on his face. The storm was still just a bruise on the horizon, but it was coming. You didn't need a barometer or a fancy forecast to know that. You just needed to feel the air go still in your lungs, to notice the birds vanish, the rabbits go to ground, the land hold its breath. Luke didn't fear the wind or the rain. He feared what storms stirred up, things buried deep, past regrets, or worse, strangers with nowhere left to run. The wire snapped once, sharp as a whip crack, and Luke swore under his breath. Barbed and stubborn, like everything out here. He yanked it tighter, looped it around the post, and listened as the windmill groaned behind him. A single cow lowed somewhere across the flat. He glanced south and squinted. The sky was building itself into a wall, dark purple and muscle thick. Lightning licked the edge of it, quiet for now, but promising fire. Then came the sound of hooves. Sheriff Nolan Creed rode up from the trail, dust haloed around his boots, duster flapping in the rising breeze. Nolan wasn't a man for small talk. His face said most of what needed saying, and what it said now was this: something's wrong. Storm's not the only thing coming, Nolan said without greeting, dismounting like he'd done it since the womb. Luke straightened. What else? There's a girl walking the old mining trail, name's Isabella Rios, young, alone. Folks in Bluff say she's been on foot 2 days, carrying something close to her chest like it's all she's got left. Luke didn't blink. And? Trail she's on ain't fit for a jackrabbit, let alone a girl. Sunstroke, snakes, you name it. But she's headed this way, maybe. The wind shifted. Luke smelled it. Rain, sagebrush, and something else. Trouble. Nolan looked hard at him. She's either desperate or running from something that's worse than dying out there. You see her, you take her in. Folks sniffing around Bluff. 2 men from Gallup don't seem the friendly type. Luke nodded. Nolan swung back onto his horse without another word and rode off, his silhouette folding into the storm. The fence work felt pointless after that. Luke's hands moved, but his thoughts weren't on the wire. They were on a stranger walking into a storm, and the sheriff's eyes when he said, "Don't let her die out there." By twilight, the clouds had bloomed thick across the mesas, bruising the sky in deep purple and black. Lightning played quietly in the distance. Luke had moved the cattle to shelter, tied down tools, latched every window. Still, he paced the porch like a man waiting on something he couldn't name. Then, faint and cutting through the wind, came a whistle. Not the windmill, not a bird, a call, 2 short, 1 long. Luke grabbed his slicker and was on Buck in seconds, riding hard toward the sound. The rain began just as he reached the creek bed, a curtain of warm silver slapping against his face. He saw the figure stumble, then drop to one knee. The satchel she held never left her hands. He leapt from the saddle before the gelding stopped, boots sinking in the mud. "Miss?" She looked up slowly. Wet hair clung to her cheeks. Her eyes were dark and wide, full of exhaustion, suspicion, and something else. Hope, maybe. "I'm Luke Rollins," he said. "You don't have to talk. Just come with me." She nodded, barely. He lifted her into the saddle and swung up behind. She didn't weigh much. He held her steady as Buck carried them back through the thickening storm. Her shivering soaked into his coat, but she never let go of the satchel. By the time they reached the ranch, the wind was screaming. He took her to the barn first, warmer than the house somehow, maybe because it smelled of life. Hay, horses, and oil. He wrapped her in blankets, lit the lantern, and handed her a cup of coffee with shaking hands. She drank like she hadn't in days. "What's your name?" he asked softly. "Isabella," she said. "Rios." That was all. Luke didn't push. He just nodded, stoked the fire, and watched her drift toward sleep. But inside, something was stirring. Not pity, not curiosity, something older. A feeling he hadn't allowed himself in years. The wind howled, and the wire sang again, but this time it wasn't the only thing whispering through the night. There was something about this girl. Something in the way she clung to that satchel like it held her past, present, and future all at once. Something in the way she'd chosen to face the storm rather than what lay behind her. And Luke Rollins, a man who'd spent the last 10 years building fences to keep the world out, felt the first crack in those walls. He didn't know yet what she carried, but he knew this. She hadn't stumbled onto his land by accident. Some stories begin with gunfire. Others start with a whisper on the wind. This one began with both. And it wasn't finished yet. The rain didn't let up. It came hard, warm, and full of noise, thundering against the barn roof like it had something to say. Inside, the girl sat curled in the farthest corner, swaddled in a wool blanket too big for her frame. The lantern on the shelf cast long shadows that danced across the hayloft, playing tricks on the walls, but Luke Rollins wasn't watching shadows. He was watching her, Isabella Rios, if she'd told him true. She'd barely spoken since they'd gotten back. Just her name and a nod. Still clutching that satchel like it held a beating heart. Luke had seen fear before, had seen men broken by weather, by war, by loss. But what he saw in her was something else. Not fear, not even desperation. It was resolve, carved deep beneath exhaustion. He handed her a chipped tin mug of a hot coffee and sat across from her, back resting against the wall. "You warm enough?" She nodded, sipped, and then, in a voice rough like old rope, said, "I can leave in the morning." Luke looked at her. "Ain't asking you to." Isabella didn't answer. She just stared at the firelight glinting off the satchel's worn leather. Minutes passed. Maybe more. The kind of silence that stretches across wide country and broken hearts. "Storms likely to last all night," he said, more to fill the quiet than anything else. She looked at him then, really looked. "You don't know what I'm running from." Luke gave a faint nod. "Don't have to. I seen enough storms roll in to know when something ain't right." She looked down, hands tightening on the satchel. "My father was a leather worker," she said, voice soft and slow like molasses. "Had a small shop in Gallup. Good man, honest. One day, men came with papers and promises. Said he owed them. He didn't, but they didn't care." Her voice cracked. She caught it fast. They gave him two choices: pay or hand over his tools. His name, his trade, he refused. They beat him so bad he couldn't stitch a boot after. Died 2 weeks later. Luke didn't move. He didn't offer comfort. He just listened. "I found this after," she said, tapping the satchel. "Ledger, names, dates, codes. My papa kept it. Thought if something ever happened it might speak for him. I think it's why they killed him. And if they find me..." She didn't finish. Outside, the wind clawed at the eaves. Luke leaned forward. "So that's what you carry?" Isabella nodded. "It's not just a book, it's weight and danger." He studied her a moment longer, then stood and offered a hand. "Come inside. This place is warmer, drier. You shouldn't sleep in a barn if you don't have to." She hesitated. He didn't press, just waited. At last, she took his hand. In the house, the fire still burned low, filling the room with the kind of warmth that wasn't just about heat. Luke fixed her a bowl of stew, beans, dried beef, and potatoes from the root cellar. She ate in slow, careful bites. He poured her a second cup of coffee, strong and bitter. "You planning to turn me in?" she asked finally. Luke met her eyes. "For what? For surviving?" She set the cup down. "You don't even know me." "Maybe not. But I know trouble when it walks through a storm to get here, and I know what it means to be hunted." A beat of silence. "You've been hunted?" Luke smiled faintly, the kind that didn't reach the eyes. "We all carry ghosts." For a long time, neither spoke. Then, quietly, she said, "Thank you. For the food, for not asking too many questions." "You can stay tonight," he said. "And longer, if need be. We'll figure it out come morning." Isabella leaned back, her face a little softer than before. She still didn't let go of the satchel, but her shoulders lowered an inch. Luke stood and added a log to the fire. As sparks flared and the wind outside sang its eerie tune, he felt something shift in the room. Not safety, not trust, not yet, but something close. He didn't tell her about the two riders Sheriff Nolan mentioned. He didn't tell her he'd seen shapes on the ridge last week, shadows that moved wrong in the night. He just said, "If they come, we'll be ready." She didn't answer, but she didn't deny it either. Later that night, as the fire dimmed to glowing coals, and the house settled into the deep quiet of old timber and honest walls, Luke lay awake in the next room. He could hear the wind fussing with the shutters, the occasional drip of rain off the eaves, and he could hear her breathing, soft but steady. He hadn't had someone under his roof in years. Not since, well, that wasn't worth pulling back up. But as he stared at the ceiling, Luke couldn't help but wonder what would happen when morning came. He'd taken her in, fed her, gave her a place to rest. But the thing about storms was, they never just passed. They left things behind. And Luke Rollins had a feeling this one had only just begun. Dawn broke uneasy over the valley, the kind of gray light that whispered of unfinished business. The rain had stopped, but the ground still held the memory, muddy, soft, as if the earth hadn't yet decided whether to move on or sink deeper. Luke Rollins stood at the porch rail with a cup of coffee that had long gone cold, eyes scanning the horizon like a man expecting company. And in his gut, he knew. Whatever had brought Isabella Rios to his door hadn't stopped with the storm. He found her already outside, standing at the edge of the corral, hair tied back, boots half sunk in wet clay. She was feeding the chickens, one hand steady, the other still clutching that satchel like a lifeline. "You sleep any?" he asked, not unkindly. "Some," she said. The quiet was louder than I expected. They ate breakfast together, simple, hearty, enough to make you feel like the day had a chance. Isabella fixed the leather strap on a busted saddle while Luke oiled the hinges on the barn door. But even as they worked, something lingered in the air between them. Not discomfort, not suspicion. Something else. The kind of tension that comes when two people carry more truth than they've spoken out loud. By mid-morning, Sam Harland arrived. He came riding in from the ridge, dust on his coat and wind in his hair. Sam wasn't much older than Luke, but wore the years differently, looser, louder. The kind of man who knew when to laugh and when to load a rifle. He dismounted with a low whistle. "Heard you had company." Luke nodded. "She's inside." Sam didn't ask more. Not yet. They went into the house where Isabella sat at the table sewing a split bridle. She looked up, calm but wary. Sam tipped his hat. "Sam Harland," he said. "Friend of Luke's, and Sheriff Nolan's got more ears than folks think, so I came to see it for myself." Isabella gave the barest nod. Over coffee, Sam laid it out plain. 2 men from Gallup were asking around Bluff. Tall one walks with a limp. Short one looks like he eats bullets for breakfast. They're not hired help. They're muscle. They're looking for a girl with a satchel and a secret. Sounds like they know she's close. Luke turned to Isabella. "They after you? Or what you're carrying?" She looked down at the satchel, then back up. "Both." Then, for the first time, she opened it. Inside was a book. Not large, but thick with wear. Leather-bound, corners frayed. She slid it across the table, her hands slow, careful. "My father kept records," she said. "Not just customers, not just inventory, names, dates, deals, things that shouldn't have been written down." Luke flipped it open. The writing was small and sharp. Pages full of symbols, initials, figures that didn't add up unless you knew what you were looking at. "Smuggling?" Sam asked. "Worse," she said. "Land fraud, bribes, payoffs. My papa was honest, but they used his business to launder it all. When he found out, he kept the book, thought it might protect us. But it didn't." Sam let out a low breath. "That ledger's a death sentence if the wrong folks know you have it." "I know," she said. Luke stared at the pages, then at her. "You could leave, head east, try to disappear." She shook her head. "Running only works when no one's chasing you. These men won't stop, not for the law, not for distance, not for anything." The room went quiet. Luke stood slowly, walked to the window and stared out across his land. The fence lines, the fields, the quiet steadiness he'd built from years of grit and grief. He thought of how easy it had been to live alone, to trust no one, to keep everything at arm's length. But this girl had brought a storm with her, and maybe, just maybe, he wasn't willing to watch it take everything down. He turned back. "There's one way to make you untouchable," he said. Sam raised an eyebrow. "You serious?" Luke ignored him. Isabella looked up. "What way?" "Marriage," he said. "Legal? Public? Gives you my name, gives you rights, gives us a reason to stand together that no ledger can break." She blinked. "That's not something you just say." "I wouldn't," he said, "not unless I meant it." She stared at him for a long moment. The fire crackled in the hearth. Rain began again outside, soft but steady. "I've known you 2 days," she said. "I know," Luke replied, "but sometimes it don't take long to know when something's worth standing for." She looked at the ledger, then at him, and nodded. "All right, let's do it." Sam clapped once. "Well, hell, that's the first honest thing I've seen done around here in months." Luke went to saddle the horses. Sam sent word ahead to the sheriff. They'd ride into Bluff before sundown, and when they came back, it wouldn't be as strangers anymore. Not man and girl, not rancher and fugitive, but husband and wife. And what was about to come for them would have to get through both. The sun hadn't even reached the middle of the sky when they rode back from Bluff, husband and wife in name now, bound by more than a signature in a dusty chapel ledger. Sheriff Nolan had witnessed it himself, said the words that made it legal, but there was something older and deeper than law in the way Luke looked at her now. He wasn't sure what he'd expected, maybe a sense of finality, maybe peace, but what settled over his shoulders as they approached the ranch was something heavier, like the hush before a gunshot. Sam was waiting by the barn, arms crossed, eyes fixed on the horizon. He didn't have to speak. Luke followed his gaze. 4 riders. South Ridge, just over the rise. Dust in their wake, glint of steel at their hips. They weren't hiding. They wanted to be seen. The kind of men who didn't believe in knocking. Isabella dismounted and handed off her reins to Sam, her movements steady but tense. Luke stepped forward, boots crunching dry earth, spine straight as a fence wire. The smell of old rain still hung in the air, earthy and sharp. Somewhere, a hawk cried. The lead rider slowed, then stopped. It was the tall one, lanky, broad in the shoulders, and walking his horse like it knew violence. His limp was more pronounced up close. Behind him came the short, thick man with eyes like stones and 2 others flanking. "You Rollins?" the tall man asked. Luke nodded. "We're here for the girl, the ledger she carries, and whatever lies she spun to wrap you up in it." Luke didn't blink. "Her name's Isabella Rollins, and whatever she's carrying, it's hers now. That's the only truth that matters." The short man leaned forward in the saddle, spat into the dust. "She's got something don't belong to her." "Take it up with the sheriff," Luke said. "You're on my land, and I don't take kindly to threats." The tall man's jaw flexed. "You think a piece of paper changes who she is?" "No," Luke said, "but it changes who she belongs to, and that ledger you want? It's been copied, sealed, and will be in Nolan's hands if anything happens to either of us." That was a lie, but it was the kind of lie that might buy time. The men shifted in their saddles. Sam stepped beside Luke, Colt low on his hip, but ready. Isabella stood on the porch behind them, arms crossed, her face a mask of steel. "You sure you want to stake yourself in her fight?" the tall one asked. Luke looked him dead in the eye. "This ain't her fight anymore. It's mine." Silence stretched like a taut rope. Wind stirred the dust. One of the riders' horses stamped nervously. The tall one studied Luke like a man measuring distance to a coffin. Finally, he clicked his tongue and turned his mount. "You've made your choice. That's a hell of a thing to die over." "Then best you don't make me prove it," Luke replied. They rode off slow, not in retreat but in warning, the kind that promised they'd be back, and next time they wouldn't come talking. No witnesses, no words. The dust hadn't settled before Sam exhaled. "We've got until dusk tomorrow, maybe. That was a courtesy visit. A knock on the door before the fire starts." Luke turned to Isabella. She hadn't moved, hadn't flinched. "We prepare," he said. All that afternoon they reinforced the fence, moved the cattle north, stacked wood in barrels, loaded weapons. The house became a fortress not of walls but of intent. Every tool was sharpened, every latch secured. Luke worked in silence, Isabella at his side. Sam kept to the ridge, eyes scanning the horizon with a soldier's gaze. As twilight drew its first line across the land, lanterns flickered along the eastern fence. Sam laid out the plan by lamplight, voice low and sure. "They'll come from the south, try to use the barn for cover. I'll stay by the corral. You two take the house. We hold till Nolan gets here. If he don't, we hold anyway." Luke nodded. Isabella didn't speak. Her hands were steady as she cleaned the old Winchester, each movement deliberate. As if she wasn't preparing to fight, she was preparing to survive. Before turning in, Luke sat with her on the porch. The moon hung like a nail in the sky, stars stretched thin as prayer. In the distance, an owl called again. He looked at her, and in that moment, he didn't see a fugitive or a widow's daughter. He saw the woman who had walked through rain and fire to sit here beside him. "You could still run," he said gently. She shook her head. "I've run enough. If they come, I want to be standing beside you, not behind." He reached for her hand. It was calloused now. Not soft, but real. The kind of hand that helped rebuild a barn, cleaned a wound, stitched a life. "I never planned for any of this," he said. "Me either," she replied. "But I think that's what makes it worth it." They didn't need more words. The night carried the rest. As they stepped inside, the storm clouds had long passed, but in their wake came something more dangerous than weather. Men with no mercy, no memory, and nothing left to lose. And they were coming fast. When they rose the next morning, the sun rose red and slow, dragging shadows across the land like old regrets. Luke strapped on his holster without a word. Isabella laced her boots tight, then placed the ledger in a locked drawer. They ate together, quiet, firm, the way folks do when they know time is short. Sam rode back from the ridge with a grim nod. They'll be here by sunset. Nobody spoke after that. The waiting began, and if it was their last stand, they'd make it count. Together. They came just as the sky turned copper. 4 riders like ghosts rising from the desert floor, their silhouettes sharp against the dying sun. Dust coiled around their boots, their faces set with the kind of calm that only comes when a man thinks he's got nothing to lose. Luke and Sam stood ready at the eastern fence, rifles in hand, while Isabella watched from the loft window of the barn, her fingers tight around the trigger of the Winchester. The first shot split the silence like a strike of lightning, and everything after that moved fast. Flashes, thunder, the smell of gunpowder mingling with sweat and dust. Luke moved like he'd been born for this moment, each pull of the trigger calm, measured, true. Sam shouted orders, covering the south flank, his voice a steady drumbeat in the storm. But it wasn't just men with guns that fought that night. It was memory, pain, a fight not just to live, but to matter. The riders were fast, ruthless. 2 broke toward the barn. 1 dismounted, tried to circle wide through the corral. But Isabella had seen war in her father's eyes once, and she recognized it now. She didn't flinch, she didn't hesitate. The crack of her rifle echoed like thunder off the mesa walls. By the time the dust settled, 2 of them were down. 1 limped off, another lay bleeding beneath the cottonwoods. Sheriff Nolan arrived not long after, his own gun smoking, his jaw set like stone. The last of the riders, wounded, furious, and afraid, was dragged into town in cuffs, his words slurred with rage and loss. But the ledger stayed where it belonged, untouched in Luke's drawer. The next morning, the sun rose clean and gold, the way it only does after something has been burned to the ground and rebuilt from the ash. The land was quiet, heavy with the smell of spent powder and broken promises. Luke stood on the porch, coffee in hand, looking out over the pasture. Isabella came up beside him, her braid damp from the basin, her sleeves rolled, her hands still smelling of gun oil and lavender. She didn't say anything at first, just looked. "It's over," Luke said, though it didn't feel like the truth yet. "Maybe," she replied, "or maybe it's just the beginning." They didn't speak much that morning. There was work to do, cattle to move, a barn to patch, bullet holes to fill. But there was no longer a weight in their steps. What they'd fought for hadn't just been a name or a ledger. It had been something harder to define. Dignity, maybe, or simply the right to stay. In the weeks that followed, the ranch took on a different rhythm. Isabella transformed the old shed into a leather shop. She repaired bridles, saddles, and belts, and began teaching young girls from nearby farms how to stitch strong and straight. She moved with quiet purpose, every corner of the ranch slowly shaped by her hands. Luke found himself waking earlier, walking the fence line not just to check for breaks, but to listen to the wind, to the calls of morning birds, to the laughter coming faint from the shop. He'd never thought his days would be shared again, but here he was, splitting firewood while a pot of stew simmered on the stove, counting steps by the weight of another's beside him. Sam came by often, never for long, always bringing something, news from Bluff, a fresh batch of coffee beans, a cracked stirrup needing work. He grinned more now, eyes squinting at the porch like he couldn't quite believe what he saw. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the shadows stretched out like stories yet to be told, Isabella sat on the porch steps, a shirt in her lap, needle flashing in the fading light. Luke watched her, content in the silence. "What are you sewing?" he asked. She smiled. "Your old flannel. Thought I'd make it into something worth wearing again." He didn't answer, just sat beside her, hand brushing hers as he reached for the thread. The land around them held still. Not in fear, not in waiting, but in peace. Later that night, after the lantern had burned low and the dogs had quieted, Luke stepped outside one last time. The stars above stretched wide and deep, old as time. Somewhere out past the cottonwoods an owl called. He breathed in the scent of mesquite smoke and dust and leather. He thought of the day Isabella first arrived, ragged, silent, clutching that satchel like it held her soul. He thought of the way the storm had rolled in, not just from the sky, but from her past, dragging trouble and truth in equal measure. And now, standing here, he knew what had truly changed. He wasn't waiting anymore. He was living. And not just for himself. They had built something, he and Isabella, not with nails or contracts or paper, but with firelight and quiet strength and the kind of love that doesn't ask for proof. The days passed like steady hoofbeats, unremarkable in their details but sacred in their rhythm. They planted herbs behind the house. He taught her how to mend the irrigation lines that ran through the lower pasture. She, in turn, taught him how to thread a needle without cursing. Sundays brought visits from neighbors who'd once only nodded from a distance. Now they came with jam jars and toolboxes, with children eager to pet the horses or listen to Sam's exaggerated stories on the porch. In time, the ranch bore the marks of them both. Her handwriting on notes tacked to the pantry, his coat hanging beside hers by the door. And between the walls, a silence no longer filled with emptiness, but with ease. Out here, where storms rose fast and death rode hard, they had built a home, one worth keeping. In the wake of everything they endured, it's not the gunfire or the shouts that linger in memory. It's the stillness that followed. That quiet after the reckoning, where even the wind seemed to pause, uncertain whether it should press forward or leave them in peace. What happened at the edge of that humble ranch was more than a fight over property or a ledger of debts. It was the kind of stand that echoes, long after boots have walked away and bullets have gone silent. Luke hadn't been looking for redemption, and Isabella hadn't come seeking rescue. But fate doesn't always ask what you want. Sometimes it brings you storms to test whether you still believe in sunrises, and that's what they found, through grit, bullets, blood, and quiet compassion. A sunrise worth waking up to. Their story is stitched from the same rawhide and smoke that built the Old West, but it also sings with something deeper. The courage to stay when it's easier to run, the choice to care when it's safer to shut down, and the unspoken promise that even wounded hearts can find rhythm again. What began with a loose wire and a hum in the wind ended with a home built on trust. The land did not grow softer. The world did not grow kinder. But inside that fence line, they made a life rooted in dignity, choice, and the kind of fierce loyalty that asks no questions yet speaks louder than vows. It would have been easier for Luke to tell her to keep moving, for Isabella to disappear back into the shadows of New Mexico, where no man dared call her by name. But what they did instead, they faced the storm, together. And isn't that something we all crave in the end? Not a perfect life, not even a safe one, but a shared one. A life where someone sees us, all our scars and silence, and stays. They didn't tame the West. They didn't chase fortune or carve their names in history books. What they did was far quieter and far more powerful. They carved out a corner of the world where hope had the room to take root again. A ranch where leather was mended, coffee brewed strong, and trust was the currency that truly mattered. So, what can we take from Luke and Isabella's tale? Those of us living in a time so far removed from six-shooters and storm cellars. We live in a world full of noise. Headlines, horns, hurry. It's easy to think that peace is found in distance, or that love needs grand gestures. But maybe the truest lessons still come from those dusty front porches, from the whisper of cottonwoods, from the quiet strength of two people choosing each other every single day. Luke teaches us that solitude can keep a man safe, but it can also leave him hollow. That it's braver to open your door to a stranger than it is to bar it forever. And Isabella shows us that running buys you time, but standing your ground buys you freedom. They remind us that the fight worth having isn't always loud. Sometimes it's just sitting beside someone in the middle of a storm and saying, "I'm not going anywhere." Their story urges us to be the kind of people who build, not just survive, to tend fences, not just fortify walls, and when the day comes that the past rides up our drive with bad intentions, to meet it, not with fear, but with the calm steadiness of someone who's found something to believe in. And above all, it reminds us that home isn't a place. It's not four walls or a plot of land. It's the person who hands you a steaming mug after a hard day. It's the sound of laughter echoing through a place that once only knew silence. It's a ranch rebuilt from grit and grace. If Luke and Isabella taught us anything, it's that no storm lasts forever, that even the harshest winds eventually die down. And when they do, if you've held on tight enough, what remains is stronger than what stood before. So wherever you are, city high-rise or country porch, know this: it's never too late to stop running. Never too late to believe in something again, and never too late to build a life that matters, even if it begins with a whisper in the wind. And maybe that's the greatest lesson of all. Storms will come, sometimes fierce and unforgiving. But so will days of sun and laughter, and mornings filled with the smell of coffee and fresh earth. We must choose to keep showing up for each other, to keep mending what's broken, and to hold tight to those who walk through fire with us, because those are the souls who make life worth living. Thank you for riding through this journey with us. If this story moved you, if it stirred a memory or sparked a thought, please consider subscribing to our channel. Your support helps us keep these stories alive. Tales of courage, hope, and the quiet heroes who built the backbone of the West. Hit that subscribe button, leave a comment about what touched you most, and stay with us for the next legend waiting to be told. Because out here on the frontier of story and soul, every tale is a chance to remember what we're made of. See you in the next ride.